Hello and welcome to the Airline Business podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, it's an end-of-year special as we look back at the game of two halves that was 2022 through some of the airline stories that have caught our eye. My name's Graham Dunn, and joining me for the last time this year at least is Airline Business editor Lewis Harper.
Hi Graham, how are you?
Yes, very good, very good. We've a year back doing the podcast and we've smoothed our introductory moments there to get them spot on.
Yeah, I think there's only about 4 or 5 different takes that you need to mash together to get that.
It should be the easiest bit to do, shouldn't it? But there you go. Yes, here we are. We've got through to the end of the year, and I sort of describe it as a game of two halves because the year ends for all the slightly bleak economic news and the headwinds that are out there. It ends in sort of much more positive fashion.
It does, yeah. We've talked a lot in the past couple of pods about a really strong third quarter earnings season, I think, for a lot of airlines. So North America was already sort of ahead of the game a bit in the recovery, but that's really spread to Europe in the second half, and also obviously Asia, which has been lagging because COVID restrictions haven't been dropped as quickly. We're even seeing some signs of China obviously relaxing its policies, and given the size of that market, that's obviously something to look out for in 2023. As you say, it very much a year or two halves.
So we spent quite a lot of time in the nerve centre of the Airline Business newsroom trying to come up with a structure or cleverly formulate how we should sort of try to unpick the last year. And in the end, we've just decided we're going to talk about some of the stories that kind of caught our eye, for want of a better way of putting it. And I guess, one of the more interesting stories to our mind is KLM, isn't it?
Yeah, when you think about airlines that kind of are at the centre of some of the biggest trends in the industry, if not, they might not be making all the headlines all the time, but KLM stand out, I think, for probably 2 or 3 reasons, really. One, as ever with them, on the sustainability side of things, and some challenges there. We've always been used to them being kind of on the front foot in that regard, but it almost feels like that's coming back to bite them slightly, or has done over the past few months. On the operational side of things, they're also been at the centre of some of those challenges. And another issue on the diversity in the C-suite. Obviously, they're one of several airlines this year that have appointed a female CEO, and that's an encouraging trend we've seen over the past 12 months.
Yeah, and certainly on that trend of bringing in female talent within the C-suite of airline leadership teams, we are seeing some progress on that across the year, aren't we?
Yeah, so on that one, we do an annual survey, and that will be coming out in the next issue of Airline Business in early next year. The trend, obviously, the overall numbers are still quite low in the C-suite, but for the chief executive role, I think across the top 100 airlines and groups, it's looking to be that around 10% of those will have a female CEO, which, given there was 2 or 3 years ago I did the survey and there's only 2 airlines in the top 100 had a female CEO. That does mark progress, albeit, there's clearly a long way to go. So notably, Pegasus, El Al, Austrian and others have appointed women to that top role over the past 12 months. So that's a positive trend of which KLM has been part.
As you mentioned, those other areas around, and the two of them are almost tied together around the operational challenges and sustainability issues. They both came to a head at KLM's main base in Amsterdam this year.
They did, yeah. So the main issue they have is the government proposing a cap on the number of flights from Schiphol. So KLM were pretty firm saying, this is a threat to our hub model. It's a cap that takes out tens of thousands of flights a year in theory, if it's implemented. So that is a challenge for the airline and an early challenge for Marjan Rintel as the CEO. As we were saying, KLM, almost ironically, has been an airline that you'd often look to be a leader in sustainability, and there's perhaps a painful lesson there in the sense that they're an airline that's facing quite an unusual move from their own government, sort of looking at issues such as noise. Noise pollution has always been a big issue around Amsterdam's airports, but also with an eye on the sustainability argument as well in terms of emissions. If it happens, KLM's looking at a ceiling on the number of flights from that, as you say, their key hub.
And it probably illustrates, the problem which, for many other airlines is that, it is really difficult, even those airlines that might be doing or might be seen as leaders in that field, it's very difficult for them to move fast enough on this issue. What you tend to see is that the airlines who have made progress on sustainability really kind of put that at the heart of measure, that are generally operating in areas and countries and markets where sustainability is already a really big political factor. So very little is going to change for airlines in them winning that sustainability battle, the argument around it over these next couple of years. They are going to continue to have to really stress the points of what they're doing. And, I'm sure there will be other countries and other parts of the world where airlines will face further challenges, whether that be punitive taxes, whether that be capping departures, whether that is around other mechanisms, somewhere between the stick and the carrot in trying to get airlines to be even greener than they are today.
Yeah, it's still obviously very early days in governments. The concept of governments capping aviation, as you say, the industry is well aware that if it doesn't enough, that's a big risk. And this is as I said, a very early example of that potentially happening. We also had on probably a smaller scale, we had Air France, the government there stopping some of the short domestic flights where it's possible to travel on rail. As you say, it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, really. I guess part of the reason KLM has been so big on it is that they are from a country where it's more widely recognised as an issue, whereas you look elsewhere and very often there is a correlation between how much awareness there is in society of these issues and pressure to act on them and what the airlines are doing.
Now, another of the stories that kind of caught my eye, and it always catches my eye, I've been covering this part of the world for many years, but is ITA Airways, as we discovered they were pronounced halfway through the year, the Alitalia successor carrier in Italy. And they've been interesting in terms of, not only, how do you build a startup, new carrier. They obviously began with the various assets from Alitalia. They've been in the process of refleeting. I think you were the chief executive earlier in the year at Farnborough when they had their first Airbus A350 joining the fleet. About to take, I think, A320neos, their first ones of those. So, you on the one hand, you have this new operation, new kind of fleet, trying to change the dynamic. And on the other, you have a very familiar story, which has been, Italy trying to secure an investor for the airline.
It's a familiar story, isn't it?
Very much so. And here, obviously, that's rumbled on for most of the year, continues to rumble on even as we close. Yeah, Lufthansa now, judging by various reports, seems to be the prime airline that the Italian authorities are talking to. It was the consortium which involved Air France-KLM, and in fact Delta Airlines, which was led by a private equity firm. So they were in the box seat and actually had exclusive talks, but those expired in October. It sort of had everything because it had the whole political dimension, because you had change in government in Italy. You had a boardroom battle, it appears. You had a change in the president. And at the heart of it is this idea that the Italian market remains, for all the challenges that Alitalia had, and various airlines have had a go at trying to revive that airline, Italy remains, a hugely attractive market for airlines, and it doesn't struggle to find people who seem to be interested in finding a strategic partnership with them.
They keep trying, don't they? I mean, yeah, listened to Ben Smith when he just before that deadline passed for the Air France-KLM consortium. I think he made the comment the Italian market has always been difficult, and I think it's a bit of an understatement there, as you were alluding to. I think. So yeah, that it's an interesting one to watch. Will we finally get obviously the history there, including the involvement of Etihad and things like that, make it incredibly interesting market, probably for the wrong reasons a lot of the time. And you've I know written plenty of copy on the goings on. But yeah, it could be that this could finally be the moment, but no one's holding their breath on that. I think political change is an interesting one because we can't say anything from the UK at the moment, but certainly the potential for change there could derail it, as you say again. But unions obviously been a big factor in challenges there before. So there's all sorts that could happen. But the Italian market is absolutely crucial for several carriers, and that's why there's such high interest there. And 2023 maybe.
No, 2023. And that could also be the year for more signs of consolidation in Europe. TAP Portugal is obviously one that might come up on the block, and I think Air France-KLM were among the carriers showing some interest in the Portuguese airline.
Yeah, that's right. So that's another airline that it's not a new thing for kind of a second tier national carrier in Europe that isn't part of one of the big groups. So inevitably there's talk there, and TAP themselves kind of welcome that interest a couple of months ago. So yeah, wanted to keep an eye on. Obviously, the pandemic meant the government's now 100% owner of TAP, so they're in theory anyway keen to get it off their books. So yeah, it would clearly make a lot of sense there for TAP, particularly of its strong connections to Latin America. It certainly would be an interest, I think, an asset for some of the groups there. So yeah, another one to keep an eye on, along with, of course, Air Europa with IAG, which, IAG hasn't made any secret of the fact it wants to take control there. And obviously, there have been challenges around that in the past. But certainly, yeah, the next year could bring about consolidation involving the big groups. And that's before you think about the low-cost carriers. And I don't want to start any rumours about EasyJet again by saying too much there, because I'm not sure that last round of rumours was really based on anything concrete. But certainly Europe is a place to watch for consolidation.
I guess the other story in Europe, which I think has caught our eye this year, and perhaps as an airline that maybe been written off, is Norwegian.
Yeah, not entirely, obviously, irrelevant to that consolidation argument. I remember talking to Willie Walsh when IAG were interested in the old Norwegian, as it were, and that deal was sort of in the offing for a while. But yes, interesting story that obviously going into the pandemic, they're already restructuring and talking about focus on, I guess, quality over quantity. I think they've grown very quickly and obviously into long haul markets. A lot of changes at the top over a short period. Last year, CFO Geir Carlsen took over as CEO, and obviously now Norwegian's emerging from the pandemic, and as I say, a kind of transformation process that had already been started as a short haul carrier, focused on its kind of core Scandinavian markets. And the indications are they're doing pretty well. Carlsen's pretty highly thought of, I think, in the industry, and he seems to be doing an interesting job there. Not easy being that kind of low-cost carrier in Europe with such strong competition from the three big operators in that space. But certainly encouraging signs, decent financials. Seems to have a sensible head around Norwegian's looking into winter, and it's kind of part of the strategy now to structurally reduce capacity, and that also applies to having flexibility in workforce costs as well, not just on the fleet side of things. They're kind of ramping up towards 70, 80 aircraft next year. They've placed an order to buy their own MAX jets. At the moment, there's a leased fleet. So interesting there. Of course, I think Carlsen's talked about the kind of 90 aircraft they start to get into really get the economies of scale needed for that sustainability. I guess it'll be interesting to see where they go beyond that. And I don't know if the temptation will come back to buy some 787s or whatever, but certainly no indications they'll go too crazy at the moment.
And I think it is interesting, that transatlantic long haul part. Obviously, they withdrew from that market in amongst their major restructuring and developed that main focus. But, the legacy of what they did there remains, and we've seen it with the legacy of another carrier in that sector, WOW, which fell by the wayside, but you've seen a successor in that market. And there's no question that at least part of that model, whether that is the premium economy mark or leisure premium market that people are interested in, or the ability to operate narrow-body, long-haul narrow-body aircraft, especially flights from points in Europe to the East Coast in the US, you're seeing that reflected in lots of other elements there. And, SAS actually has just announced plans to serve Newark from regional points in Denmark and Sweden, which is, it definitely feels like it's part of some of the ground that Norwegian made happen, I guess.
It's always difficult in Norwegian. Like you say, they really did shake up that market without necessarily, as ever, without conclusively proving that the low-cost long haul on transatlantic is kind of viable in the long term. But there are people, we've got North Atlantic who, obviously have strong connections with former Norwegian staffers there. They're attempting to do some of that again with 787s that were previously in Norwegian's hands. So people will keep trying, and we can keep writing features about whether or not the low-cost long-haul concept is doomed or not. So
doomed, revived. We're on a constant cycle of it. When we look across the Atlantic in the US, I mean, it is difficult to see, for sheer scale of ambition last year, it is difficult to see past United Airlines at the moment, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I think I'm going to borrow your phrase, which I've actually forgotten now. How is it you described it?
Statement of intent.
Yeah, statements of intent, that's the one. Yeah, Scott Kirby, obviously CEO at United, seems to be fond of them. I don't know, that's I'm not suggesting there's clearly substance behind it as well, but if you're going to pick out any US airline over the past 12 months that has made those statements of intent, I think in interesting ways as well. I think United really do stand out. I think just a couple of weeks back there was another bumper order for 100 wide body jets, and that reflects United is a particularly big player in international sort of long haul sector, kind of leading in the US in that regard, and clearly a lot of those aircraft are for replacement, but it's also talking about proportion being about growth. And so they're big orders, big events to announce these orders. They're big on sustainability. At the same time, they've got a kind of tentative commitment for the supersonic aircraft, which is in some respects slightly contradictory. But so United have been anything but boring this year. I think the US market is quite obviously consolidated, and in some ways, particularly in that area, and the kind of hubs and the who's got what are established to an extent. But Kirby's having a good go at keeping it interesting, I think, there definitely.
As you say, it's a highly consolidated market. It obviously could be even more consolidated with probably the other major US story of the year, which was around the pursuit of Spirit Airlines, which ultimately JetBlue came out on top of.
Yeah, a story where, we've again thinking about our coverage of this. I mean, you go from writing a story about why it makes perfect sense that Spirit and Frontier would merge, to writing one about how JetBlue thinks is going to make a success of absorbing Spirit. So JetBlue's kind of, again, talking about airlines that were interesting last year, so in the past 12 months, it's definitely there at the centre, as you say, of that fight for Spirit, where it looked a done deal that Frontier were the winners, but JetBlue wouldn't let it go, and kept upping their bid to the point where that kind of got over the line. Well, not fully over the line yet, but certainly looks like that's going to happen. Interesting in many ways, the most obvious one being that Spirit and JetBlue do not share the same business model, really. I mean, that you're probably arguably both within the low-cost sector, although JetBlue's kind of closer to the sort of hybrid market, really. I think Spirit is essentially going to become JetBlue. Obviously, from JetBlue's point of view, gives them a much bigger footprint, in terms of fleet and network, and a chance to expand in a way that would be much more difficult organically. So interesting to watch. And obviously, at the same time, leaves Frontier as kind of opens up a bit more of that ultra low cost market. If Spirit is going to kind of be JetBlueified, as it were. So interesting development there for JetBlue. And at the same time, of course, JetBlue is working much more closely with American at the moment.
Yes. So working through on the Northeast Alliance, really focusing cooperation around New York. And this is an alliance which has been working its way through the regulatory process, ploughing on it. It brings together, I think to some extent it shows that kind of slightly opportunistic or market-based approach that airlines are increasingly looking to in terms of their partnerships. I mean, the airlines still remain, active parts of alliances. In fact, we're seeing Virgin Atlantic joining SkyTeam early this year. We've actually had probably more airlines joining OneWorld than we've had for some time. But, so those alliances still have a role. But, we've seen for a long time, a lot of interest around joint venture arrangements and really zoning in on particular markets where it makes sense. I mean, JetBlue continues to have separate operations from American, and ironically, JetBlue also retracing those Norwegian steps somewhat in terms of having taken advantage of having its new long-haul narrow-body aircraft to operate across the transatlantic. And again, it's quite interesting there that those first routes that it started, Boston and New York to London Gatwick, and then it's got plans to start Paris Charles de Gaulle routes. They're flights that Norwegian formerly served. So you're seeing a lot of strands coming full circle on this.
Yeah, and of course, coming back to the on the subject of JetBlue and the issue of diversity, of course, JetBlue is one of the strongest records on that as well. Another reason that they've stood out for me over the past 12 months. Certainly at the C-suite, they've got a number of women in senior roles there, including Joanna Geraghty, who's president and chief operating officer. I think most people would say she's the most senior woman in the US airline industry there. Robin Hayes, who's the CEO, has just had a 2-year contract extension, so showing a commitment to the airline there. So yeah, and it again another interesting airline and one which is ticking the right boxes when it comes to diversity.
So we've looked at European carriers and North American carriers. After the break, we'll look at some of the other carriers that caught our eye. If you're enjoying this podcast, why not sign up for our free weekly Airline Business briefing, delivered directly to your inbox every Thursday. You can register to get our weekly briefings, together with any of Flight Global's other newsletters, for free at flightglobal.com/newsletter. Okay, and welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about North American carriers that caught our eye, and there is definitely an airline in Latin America which has been really interesting this year, Lewis.
Yeah, so Avianca, which the Colombian carrier, kind of first of all was going through a transformation on it in its own terms, in terms of shifting more towards point-to-point services, so away from the kind of more traditional kind of hub sort of legacy carrier approach. So that was going on, but obviously at the same time now it's working towards with major partner Gol, the Brazilian low-cost carrier, working towards coming together under a holding company known as Abra, which is curiously registered in the UK, I think. So an example of consolidation, but a merger not in the kind of the mold of two airlines completely joining forces, but more on the kind of IAG style approach of having this Abra holding company underneath, having the separate units with their own brands, but also trying to leverage some of the economies of scale that come from working together in a group, and also the network options and things. So if it happens, I think there's still regulatory hurdles to overcome there, but interesting for many reasons. One, the Latin America region is you talk to any CEO there, and it's always talk about how fragmented it is on many levels. Regulatory being one that's particularly annoying, I think, in that area. So it'll be an interesting one if it gets over the line. I think it would show a level of maturity in that market, and certainly another test of that kind of holding company model that is being talked of as an option elsewhere. If you look to Africa, for example, where Kenya Airways and SAA, I think, want to work together, but with a kind of similar concept. So yeah, it's one to look out for. I think what's interesting about it is that obviously the consolidation in the Latin American region has come a lot under the kind of LATAM Airlines brand there, which is at the moment by far the largest group, even given all the Chapter 11 and everything that LATAM and Avianca have been through alongside Aeromexico over the last couple of years. LATAM Airlines Group as a standalone is still by far the biggest operator. But if Abra happens and it combines Avianca, Gol, potentially the Viva airline carriers, but they're still appealing the Colombian regulators' rejection of their merger proposal there. The Sky Airline as well is potentially going to be involved, the Chilean low-cost carrier in Abra. So if you combine all them together, you suddenly get a group of airlines that is essentially by a lot of measures on a par with LATAM Airlines Group in terms of size. But certainly, one to look out for. A lot of hurdles to get over there.
Yes, as you say, that holding structure we are seeing, an increasing number of places. In fact, that's the structure that AirAsia is using in its sort of grouping together of various airline units within what's now part of Capital A. Tony Fernandez headed aviation group from Malaysia, which has units across the region, but is now also sort of bringing all those together with medium haul carrier AirAsia X, but again, retaining all their separate brands. So using that holding sort of structure, AirAsia is an interesting airline within it. They have continued to sort of try their luck in different markets, try and establish something. Asia, again, also very fragmented from a regulatory perspective. It's not like something like EasyJet, Ryanair, if it wants to just operate in a country, it just flies there and develop large presence in these bases. If they want to get involved in a market in Asia, they quite often have to establish a joint venture relationship there. And it's quite interesting. In the past 2-3 months, you've seen AirAsia exit the Indian market, where it had an investment in AirAsia India, but is now setting out to create a joint venture carrier in Cambodia. So, you continue to see the development there. The India part of that is all part of that even wider story, which is, of course, around Air India. And I think within Asia, which has obviously been a market which has been very hard hit, which has been slowly opening up from the pandemic over the course of the year, there's some really interesting stories around how some of those long-established names are developing and the challenges they face there. So obviously, on the one hand, with Air India, we're seeing, a fresh attempt to bring that together. That's under the Tata Sons leadership. So they obviously took control of the airline about a year or so ago under the privatisation, and we're now just starting to see the idea of that joined up carrier, which would have not only the assets of Air India but also Vistara, which was the airline Tata Group used to operate together with Singapore Airlines. Singapore Airlines themselves will become a minority stakeholder in there, and then you've got what was AirAsia India together with Air India Express operating in that low-cost segment. And so there's a really concerted push to try and recreate some of Air India's former glories. I guess it's been an airline that has really struggled financially. The Indian government struggled to offload it because it's heavy debt levels. And so this is a chance for it to try and reassert itself in a market in which, as we've discussed previously, low-cost carrier Indigo in particular is well established, and we're expecting a very sizable and noteworthy order from Air India next year, I assume. But maybe they'll squeeze it in before the end of this year. Who knows? So we're expecting less stranger things, but we're certainly expecting that. And so that they're trying to recreate some of that past glories, and then you have Singapore Airlines and Cathay, two really established airlines who had no domestic market to fall back on. So, whilst both very established cargo operators and very creative around developing those parts of the market, both of them have Singapore and Hong Kong as no domestic market to speak of. So you are looking at how do they establish their business. And Singapore Airlines has been sort of very aggressive, I guess, and they've actually recovered remarkably quickly, haven't they?
Yeah, they're kind of now, making a virtue of the fact that they were kind of first movers in the region in many ways. I mean, that again is clearly not down to them entirely, although as an airline leader, you need to position the business to take advantage of the government, allowing travel. But we had vaccinated traveller lanes into Singapore, one of the kind of earliest moves to facilitate international travel in the region. And as you say, with no domestic market, that's a big deal for Singapore Airlines. But they've certainly kind of positioned themselves to be the airline powering the sector out of the region out of the crisis. And that showed through in their financials for the third quarter of the year, where they were unusual really in Asia as a sort of also achieving kind of record levels of revenue and operating profit. That was a trend we saw at several airlines in Europe and kind of North America, really benefiting from the strong demand and high yields. But Singapore Airlines also got a bit of that action, and that was unusual in that region. So they're positioned to bounce back and benefiting from government policy. I think the story when we look at Hong Kong though is slightly different, isn't it?
Yeah, and that has been a really challenging year for Cathay Pacific. It's been a year in which travel has been really restricted. Even at the start of the year, even operating its lucrative cargo operation was made challenging by the COVID-related restrictions. We have seen, an easing in that. The restrictions are gradually falling away. There was a further lifting in that in the last couple of days, but in December they will still be operating something like a third of the passenger capacity that they had pre-pandemic. I think at the moment they're looking at maybe being back up to 70% at the end of next year. They are looking very much at 2024 before they'll be back at pre-pandemic levels. That's a big gap to make up. And they have a new man in charge. Ronald Lam is the Chief Commercial Officer. He takes over from Augustus Tang, who steps down at the end of the year. So there's a new chief executive to take that task forward. And clearly, like all carriers in the region, but probably more so than many, what happens in terms of COVID restrictions and the opening up of markets in China is going to be a major factor as well for Cathay.
Yeah, Cathay, very much beholden to developments in that regard. Also worth mentioning with Cathay, of course, again, in a bit of contrast to Singapore Airlines, that going into COVID, it was hardly in a good place either because of the challenges in Hong Kong, the protests and the kind of unrest that did affect demand for travel and going into the crisis. So it's an airline where there's, it's a fascinating story to watch, but clearly pretty painful for anyone directly involved with it. And as you say, I think it's a measure of how tough things have been for Cathay that, reaching, 30-40% of pre-crisis capacity is kind of amazing news for them, given the lows they've seen over the past couple of years. So Cathay, as you say, China more broadly, some signs of a bit more life there in terms of airlines, talking about ramping up international capacity again. But as we talk now, I know there's, the kind of relaxations of COVID restrictions within China are having an effect on hospitalisation levels. And there are no guarantees that it's going to be a smooth ride to something like normality there. So another reason why Cathay is going to be, it is optimistic there's going to be a heavy dose of caution with that as well.
Probably if you were looking for an airline that contrasted more than Cathay during the pandemic, it's probably Qatar Airways, the airline that was probably most active during the crisis, continued to operate. And, in terms of those big Gulf carriers, you have seen a very active year for Qatar Airways, for Emirates. They have been, adding back capacity. We're both now flying A380s Emirates because of its passion for flying A380s. Qatar, probably more to do with its ongoing courtroom battle with Airbus over the A350s, which has, been another lengthy story for the year. Certainly in the Middle East region, Etihad has been an interesting story. We saw a slimmed down, more focused Etihad emerge from the crisis. They really did go into the crisis having had some difficult years after a very ambitious expansion strategy and investment strategy that unwound pretty spectacularly. And they've emerged. Ironically, they also now, as we discussed on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, bringing back A380s as well. But Etihad emerges as a sort of smaller, more focused operator in the Gulf. There are signs, though, that there are ambitions from a neighbouring carrier in the Gulf to step up its presence in the shape of airline strategy in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and all these kind of things kind of are linked, aren't they? Because talking about Etihad, of course, a lot of people were sceptical that the Middle East region really needs, 3 big hubs. Perhaps Etihad is a lesson in that. But as you say, in Saudi Arabia, as part of a much bigger, opening up of the country to investment and tourism in particular, obviously particularly relevant to the airline side of things, they're launching a new flag carrier to be based from Riyadh. Obviously, Saudia is based in Jeddah. So the big plans to, and I think, again, when we talk about orders to look out for aircraft orders, I think that's one that is going to be on its way soon. Obviously, again, overlapping with Etihad, I'm not sure it's been officially announced, but I think it's widely known that Tony Douglas has left Etihad now, and is obviously that's been announced because they've got a new CEO. But yeah, his next role is going to be leading that new flag carrier in Saudi Arabia. So big ambitions there. As I mentioned before, I think there's partly driven by a big push to attract tourism into Saudi Arabia. So obviously having the new carrier going into the capital there would be crucial in that effort. We've seen Wizz Air already moving into that market. That's all part of that kind of effort to expand connectivity into Saudi Arabia. So investment in obviously infrastructure is a big part of this Saudi effort. And as I say, it also extends into much more widely into the aerospace sector and things. So when we talk looking ahead, I think Saudi Arabia is the country to watch. I think the questions are, a big drive for tourism, makes sense. But attempting to launch a third hub carrier in the Middle East is certainly not going to be easy, I think it's fair to say.
No, absolutely. So there we should probably, with our thoughts already turning to 2023, we should probably leave it for another year. Lewis, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Graham.
So that is all we have time for. You can find links to the stories we've referenced in the podcast notes, and you can keep up to date with all the stories from across the industry at flightglobal.com. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, and we'll see you again in 2023.